Welcome back to Davenant Academy. I'm Dr. Brad Littlejohn, and this is our class, Introduction to the Reformation. Our lesson today is entitled, The Empire Strikes Back. In this lesson, we will see how the Reformation, in Germany at least, almost came to an end in the later 1530s after 3 decades of successful expansion. Before we do that, though, I want to go back a little bit to the 1530s and talk about some of the controversies that had been simmering along among the Protestant leaders in Germany and, predominantly in Germany. Because you may remember when we left this part of the Reformation last, we had talked about the Augsburg Confession, that was the Protestant attempt to summarize their doctrines before the emperor. But we'd also talked about the conflicts between Luther and Zwingli, particularly on the doctrine of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. Luther held to a strongly realist understanding of the presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, whereas Zwingli believed that it was simply a spiritual presence. We talked about the colloquy of Marburg, where the two sides tried to get together and negotiate a compromise and ultimately were not able to come to a shared statement of belief. So this meant that Protestantism was not going to speak with a fully united voice on the continent in the face of the imperial threat. And of course, Luther blamed Zwingli for this, seeing him as little better than a heretic. Zwingli and many others blamed Luther on the basis that Luther was being extremely stubborn and unwilling to even try to understand his opponent's point of view. One of the other crucial figures in this, of course, who we mentioned before, was Martin Bucer, the reformer in Strasbourg, Germany, southwestern Germany, who found himself in contact with the Swiss reformers, but also with the German Lutheran reformers. And he was convinced that a lot of this, at least, was a misunderstanding, and they could come to a common statement if they could just figure out the right way to express it. Bucer was right about this to some extent. I think some of the controversies on the doctrine of the Lord's Supper among the reformers were a matter of misunderstanding, and there is greater clarity now from our historical vantage point about the extent to which they were trying to say much the same thing in different ways. But there were some real differences, and Bucer was overconfident about his ability to simply solve the problem by the correct form of words. So Bucer's most successful effort to try and reconcile the two sides was a statement known as the Wittenberg Concord of 1536, the Wittenberg Concord. And in it, he set forth an exposition of the doctrine of the Eucharist that both sides were actually able to sign. Luther actually was willing to agree with it. But in the end, it never attained the kind of status of a kind of formal confessional document. And so it was sort of really just a temporary point of agreement, and controversies flared back up, particularly later in the 1540s and 1550s. Now, another attempt to articulate a shared understanding came from Philip Melanchthon, Luther's sidekick, who was always more of a peacemaker, where Luther was a kind of a grenade thrower. And Melanchthon was, of course, the author, we had mentioned, of the Augsburg Confession, that key Protestant confession of faith that tried to summarize all that Protestantism stood for in the year 1530. As the author of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon felt like it was legitimate for him to tweak it and try to clarify it at various points. And he made a few small tweaks, but the most significant tweak he made was in the year 1538. He changed the language of the article on the doctrine of the Eucharist. In the year 1540, not 1538. So the original version of this article said, "Concerning the Lord's Supper, they," that is, Protestants, teach that the body and blood of Christ are truly present and are distributed or communicated to those that eat in the Lord's Supper. And they disapprove of those that teach otherwise. 1540 version, he said, concerning the Lord's Supper, they teach that with bread and wine are truly exhibited the body and blood of Christ to those that eat in the Lord's Supper. So, this was seen by, at least later in retrospect, it really didn't actually hardly cause a ripple at the time that he made this change. And many people used the 1540 version for many years before it was later rejected by many Lutherans. But later it was seen as having been an attempt to soften the language of the Augsburg Confession and come up with a statement of Eucharistic doctrine that would be more amenable to the Swiss reformers, including later on John Calvin. Because you see here, he doesn't use language of truly present. He says that the body and blood are truly exhibited. Now, you could argue whether something can be exhibited without being present, but and Melanchthon did not see it as a substantive change. But there is a shift in emphasis here. The idea of the bread and wine are being made; they're received by the faithful communicants, but they are not just sort of statically present on the altar when the bread and wine are consecrated. In any case, this change was going to be a source of great controversy later on, although, as I said, it was not really yet in 1540. So, as we come into the 1540s, there is improving agreement among the reformers in Germany and in Switzerland. There's still a lot of bad blood, but there seems to be more of a chance of presenting a united front against the emperor, which is important because the emperor has been rumbling for years and years about how he intends to send his armies and repress those heretics and reestablish the whole of his Holy Roman Empire in obedience to the Catholic Church. But he's been too distracted with other wars to do that up until the later 1540s. And this is, in some ways, a good thing because the Protestants themselves are not at all agreed about what they ought to do if the emperor tried to impose obedience to the Pope by force. Luther himself was very hesitant about whether it was ever appropriate for Christians to rebel against or resist their governing authority. And he was eventually persuaded that indeed that the princes and dukes of the Holy Roman Empire were also part of the governing authorities. Romans 1 says, be subject to your governing authorities. So for Luther, when he was persuaded that you could be subject to the governing authorities, even if they themselves were resisting an unjust authority, the emperor, Luther was willing to accept that there could be a legitimate war against the emperor, but he was very hesitant about it, and certainly he wasn't open to any idea of kind of a preemptive strike. But Luther dies in the year 1546, and this is exactly the time when Emperor Charles V, you've seen a much younger picture of him, here's what he looked like toward the end of his reign. This was exactly the point in which Charles V was finally in a position to start mobilizing his troops and preparing to attack central and northern Germany. And so the princes of the Schmalkaldic League, that we mentioned before, began to rally their forces and prepare for a preemptive strike to hit the emperor before he could get fully prepared. This, again, I've seen this picture before. This is a document it's a picture of the agreement of the Schmalkaldic League with all the seals of the different princes and rulers who who agreed to this kind of pact of mutual defense to defend the Protestant faith in Germany by military force if necessary. Now, two of the important leaders of this were this guy, Philip of Hesse. Hesse was a very important German principality. And John Frederick, the Elector of Saxony. Saxony, of course, being where Wittenberg itself is, where Luther had lived almost all his life. And John Frederick is a devout an enthusiastic proponent of the Reformation. So Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony and their allies went to war with the emperor in late 1546. But they had not made much progress at all before the emperor was able to get together an army. And on April the 24th, 1547, April 24th, 1547, at the Battle of Mühlberg, the Protestant forces were crushed, just kind of in one fell stroke. The army was routed, and both Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony were captured. The two main Protestant leaders were captured by Emperor Charles V. So this is a seemingly disastrous moment for the Reformation in Germany. Charles the Schmalkaldic League has to disband. Basically, the road to northern Germany is open to the imperial troops. Charles V can completely assert his authority and demand religious obedience throughout his realm. And his goal is to restore all of Germany to the obedience to the Pope. So many Protestant leaders are in danger of persecution, of being forced to either renounce their faith or perhaps be killed. And so several important leaders, including Martin Butzer and Peter Martyr Vermigli in Strasbourg, fled to England, as we will talk about in a subsequent lesson. Meanwhile, however, those who are, many in Germany, are facing a very difficult decision as to whether are they going to try and stay and protect their flocks, continue to lead their churches, even if they have to renounce many of the things, or at least hide much of the faith that they had so boldly professed for now almost 30 years. The first attempt that Charles V comes up with to enforce religious obedience is called the Augsburg Interim. It's basically a decree promulgated from Augsburg in 1548, which is not absolutely doing away with everything that the Reformation had sought to achieve. Even Charles V realized it's been 30 years the Reformation has been ongoing. You can't just roll it back all at once. But the Protestants are going to be required to embrace many practices and abandon many doctrines, embrace practices that they were deeply uncomfortable with, thought that were idolatrous, and abandon doctrines that they thought were essential to the faith. Now here is what John Frederick of Saxony had to say when the emperor demanded that he sign the Augsburg Interim. He could be given back his authority if he did so. Otherwise, he was going to live in prison. So, he says, I therefore, in humility, cannot leave your majesty uninformed that I have been thoroughly taught and instructed by the servants of the divine word from youth onward, and by diligently searching the prophetic and apostolic scriptures, I have come to know, and with God's help, I attest that I maintain this in my conscience without any wavering, that the articles as comprised in the Augsburg Confession, and whatever is in the same vein, are the correct, true, Christian, pure doctrine, and are confirmed and founded in the writings of the holy prophets and apostles, and in the writings of the teachers who have followed in their footsteps, to such a degree that nothing conclusive can be produced against them. But if I were to acknowledge and accept the interim as something Christian and godly, then I would have to go against my conscience and deliberately and intentionally condemn and disown the Augsburg Confession, and that which I have hitherto maintained and believed about the gospel of Jesus Christ, and many chief articles of doctrine on which salvation depends. And I would have to approve with my mouth that which I considered in my heart and conscience to be completely and utterly contrary to the holy and divine scriptures. O God in heaven, that would be a misuse and a horrible blaspheming of your holy name, which I would have to pay dearly and all too dearly with my soul. Since then, I am tied up and imprisoned in my conscience, according to my perception of its voice. And since I know better from the instruction and proven testimonies of divine scripture, I therefore ask in all submissiveness and humility, through the mercy of God, which he has shown to the entire human race, in the incarnation and death of his only and beloved Son, our Savior and Redeemer, Jesus Christ, that the imperial majesty would not be put out by me for not agreeing to the interim, and instead stubbornly persisting in the Augsburg Confession, and for setting everything else aside and considering only how I might partake of eternal joys after this life of misery and trouble. So John Frederick never gains his freedom. He dies in prison for refusing to abandon the Augsburg Confession. And this, I think, is an eloquent statement showing that sometimes the princes who embrace the Reformation are treated as if they only did so out of political convenience because it increased their power, and they not out of genuine conviction. Statements like this, I think, show how, certainly that was many times the case, but statements like this show that in many cases, you do have truly devout Christian leaders who sought to protect the Reformation out of the conviction of their own conscience. As indeed you had devout Catholic leaders, like Charles V, who felt a conscientious obligation to restore the church to the obedience to the Pope. Now, so in 1547, 1548, it looked like the choice was going to be either basically imprisonment or recantation. They were going to have to either abandon their Protestantism or accept persecution. The dukes would be deposed of office. The pastors would be thrown out of their churches. They are successful in negotiating. Melanchthon and others have negotiated a compromise, the Leipzig interim, which basically was able to hold on to key Protestant doctrines, but which conceded that they would return to several practices of Catholic worship, things that they considered not absolutely essential issues, important issues, but not absolutely essential issues. Now, this was going to be a source of great friction and controversy going forward, because there were some that held out, some that refused to even go along with the Leipzig interim and say, no, that's giving up way too much to the Pope, that we're going to stand firm in our purified Protestant worship and teaching. One of these was the city of Augsburg in north central Germany. And Augsburg was besieged by the imperial forces in 1550, and it refused to surrender. And indeed, they put out a confession, the Augsburg Confession, saying, sort of justifying why they thought it was legitimate for them alone to hold out against the emperor, against all their authorities. Because at this point, they're holding out not merely against the emperor, but against their own prince, the new elector of Saxony, Maurice of Saxony. So they seem to be disobeying Romans 13, disobeying the teaching that Christians have to submit to their governing authorities, even if those authorities are bad. So the Augsburg Confession of 1550 is one of the first clear statements of the increasing Protestant conviction that sometimes it's legitimate for the sake of conscience to resist an ungodly ruler who is tyrannically trying to enforce violation of God's word as they understood it. So Augsburg holds out stubbornly, and in 1552, the emperor has to call on the new elector of Saxony, Maurice of Saxony, to come to raise an army to help him defeat the city of Augsburg. Now, Maurice of Saxony was a kind of devious plotter. He had been he was either the brother or the cousin of John Frederick, and but he had been a Protestant, but not nearly as devout of one, and he didn't join the Schmalkaldic League. And when the war happened, he actually sided with the emperor. He sort of saw which way the wind was blowing. He sided with the emperor, and the emperor rewarded him by giving him the electorate of Saxony in place of John Frederick. So Maurice has got what he wants. He's got power. He's got influence. He's obeying the emperor. He's a Protestant who's willing to compromise, totally willing to go along with the Leipzig interim. Well, but he starts getting second thoughts and realizes that the emperor's power is weakening and that some German Lutherans are not going to give in and indeed that they're more forceful in defending their faith and their liberties than he had ever expected. So he decides to change sides again and to become the new hero of the Protestants. And so the army that he raises ostensibly, supposedly he's raising this army to help sack Magdeburg, but instead he marches on the south to attack the emperor's own lands. And many other princes join him. And very quickly, from 1552 to 1553, all of the gains the emperor had made are reversed. And the Protestants are able to invade Austria itself. The emperor is very afraid for the security of his kingdom. And he has to abandon the Augsburg interim and grant freedom again to the Protestant princes of Germany. This is finally formalized in the Peace of Augsburg. Everything is Augsburg here. Augsburg Confession, Augsburg Interim, Peace of Augsburg in 1555. The Peace of Augsburg formalizes the principle of religious liberty, not as we understand it now, not individual religious liberty, but the liberty of each little kingdom and principality and duchy, and there are zillions of them in Germany, the liberty of each little region to decide its own religion. Was it going to be Lutheran or was it going to be Catholic? Now, so it seems like a happy ending for Lutherans in Germany. However, there is a lingering tension that's going to cause a lot of conflict later on. And that's the fact that Melanchthon, who was the main Lutheran leader now that Luther himself had died, Melanchthon had been willing to compromise on the Leipzig interim at least. He was willing to accept the return of certain Roman Catholic ceremonies and worship as long as they could hold on to the key Protestant doctrines. And for this, he thought he could do this in a principled way, and that it was indeed his responsibility to try to find a way of staying with his church in Wittenberg instead of abandoning it, or instead of being taken prisoner. But by many, when Magdeburg and other places successfully held out, Melanchthon was seen as kind of a weakling who had given in too quickly. And in particular, he was accused by this guy, Matthias Flacius Illyricus, of being basically a sellout. And from this emerges a split within the Lutherans between they're called the Philippists, the followers of Philip and Melanchthon, and the Gnesio Lutherans, Gnesio, Gnesio, the true Lutherans, who saw themselves as they were loyal to the memory of Luther himself. They followed Luther, uncompromising, bold, fearless Luther, and the other guys were softies, sellouts, followers of the weakling Melanchthon. And one of the areas in which they pushed this conflict was on the doctrine of the Eucharist. This is where Melanchthon's changed the Augsburg Confession of 1540 now starts to be seen as a big deal. This is like, this was a way in which he was abandoning Luther's own hard, bold stance on the Eucharist. And it's another way in which Melanchthon was being a softie and a compromiser. And so as the 1550s go on, a split begins within Lutheranism between those who wish to hold to a kind of pure version of Luther's teaching and have no tolerance for any other kinds of Protestants, like the Reformed, the Swiss Reformed, and the followers of John Calvin that are now becoming prominent. And on the other hand, you have the Philippists, who are still trying to maintain some unity between the Lutheran and the Reformed churches. So this decline of Melanchthon's authority and this split within Lutheranism is one of the sad lingering results of the Schmalkaldic War, even though the Protestants ended up winning that war and gaining their religious freedom in 1555. So in the next lesson, we will return to England to see how the English Reformation gained steam from 1547 onward. Why was it that England was such a good place for continental Protestants fleeing after the Battle of Mühlberg? Why was it such a good place for them to find religious freedom or a place where they could really carry out the Reformation mission that was now being stopped in Germany? So that's what we're going to look at in England in the 1540s and 1550s in the next lesson. Look forward to seeing you then.